Well, I think we'll get started, folks. My name is Patrick Goggin. I'm with Extension Lakes out of the College of Natural Resources with UW-Stevens Point. I want to welcome you to this six-county meeting. It's been going on for over 20 years in my experience. A time for us to come together and talk about lakes, rivers, and waters in the northeast part of the state and come together as a community. I want to thank the event planners, speakers, co-hosts, and partners who are coming together to join us for this event. I especially thank the Oneida County Lakes and Rivers Board for helping with the planning and connect with our speakers and put together a great lineup today, really focusing on one of our biggest topics, the world of shorelands. And first up on our agenda is Mike Engleson. Mike is the Executive Director of Wisconsin Lakes. He came to them in 2009 as first a Communications Director, and then joined in 2000, or became the Executive Director and Head Lobbyist in 2012. His experience with nonprofit organizations as board members include River Alliance work, Thousand Friends of Wisconsin work, and the Tenant Resource Center, among others. He is a graduate of Lawrence University and the University of Wisconsin Law School, which comes in handy in his advocacy work with Wisconsin Lakes. So with that, Mike, I am going to go to your PowerPoint, and I will mute myself and let you take it from here. Thanks for being with us, Mike.
Thank you, Patrick, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. You can go to the next slide. For those of you who don't know who Wisconsin Lakes is, we're the statewide nonprofit association of lake associations and lake districts and individuals who care about lakes. We do lots of things, but as Patrick said, I am a lobbyist, so I work with legislators, or at least attempt to work with legislators in Madison to advocate for sound science-based lake policy, and also we provide trainings to help people like you and your organizations advocate at whatever level and for whatever issues you're looking for. You can go to the next slide. So I'll try to keep this relatively short. This is actually an interesting year because there's not all that much legislation to talk about in comparison to last year. So I'm going to try to keep this to about 10 minutes so that there's plenty of time for people to ask questions at the end. But if you've ever seen me do one of these talks, I always, you'll be familiar with this slide. I always like to place us in the timeline of where we are in the legislative session. So the Wisconsin legislature meets in 2-year increments, and we are in the second of the 2 years. So you can see the yellow arrow that shows that we're kind of in this gap of considering legislation, and that's actually fairly typical. Even in very busy years, the legislature tends to finish around April or May. In that first year, it'll sometimes go longer because of the budget, but especially in even number years where there's an election in November, both the Senate and the Assembly tend to end their sessions and go into electioneering mode because the whole Assembly terms over every 2 years. So the Assembly and half of the Senate will be re-elected or elected in the November election. So most everything in a typical year will finish up by March. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that there was a little thing that kind of, one too many. There's a little thing that inserted itself right before the end of the session. Yep, little virus. And that actually had some huge impact, especially on the environmental legislation that was was in play this year, because though the Assembly had already finished their work, Speaker Voss likes to get things done earlier rather than later, so had crammed a ton of bills into February, and a bunch of legislation had passed the Assembly. The Senate had a floor session scheduled for the end of March where it was going to take up most of that, and the virus inserted itself, the state shut down, and then really the Senate only came back for a day to enact some COVID-related stuff. We don't know whether or not they will come back and finish up the regular legislation. If that happens, it will almost certainly happen after the election, so it would be in a lame duck session. And I think the outcome of that election, whether balances shift more towards the Republicans or the Democrats, will have a big deal, will influence whether another floor session happens in late November or December. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. Next slide. So we'll get right into the legislation. There were a couple of bills that dealt specifically with lake districts, so these don't apply to lake associations, but I did want to highlight these especially because this one especially because it does change how district voting for commissioners occurs. This bill did actually pass. So it was voted on by the Assembly and the Senate and passed in, that may have even passed at the end of 2019. But the process that it creates is that it explicitly now states in the statute that the voter must be present and get the ballot at the Lake District annual meeting to vote on the commissioner, and that ballot has to be distributed before the voting begins. This is important, especially this year, because in our opinion, this means that you really have to have a Lake District annual meeting in person, despite the pandemic. We have tried valiantly to figure out a way to allow the statute to be complied with and still have some sort of virtual voting system, but we have yet to figure anything out. So our advising to districts, yeah, of course, districts are always encouraged to seek their own counsel, and we're not providing a legal opinion in saying this, but it's our basic opinion that you do have to have, because of this new law, that there really is, you can't get around having the district meeting, annual meeting at least, in person. The law also now says that ballots have to be counted and the totals reported at that annual meeting, and then it sets up a recount process. If there are less than 100 votes cast, it's pretty simple. You keep doing recounts until 2 consecutive counts come up with the same figure. It's a little more complicated potentially if there are more than 100 votes cast. In that case, there's 1 recount conducted. That becomes the results of the election, unless the losing candidate requests a second recount, in which case the ballots are forwarded to the clerk of the largest municipality in the district, who then has 2 weeks to count and announce the winner. We don't know whether or not there will be a lot of districts that end up having to use that second procedure, but we'll see as time goes on. And if you have questions about that bill, we can talk about that at the end. Next slide. This bill, AB 600, Senate Bill 559, so the AB means Assembly Bill, the SB means Senate Bill. This bill would increase the bid threshold for lake districts. So when lake districts are making a purchase currently of $2,500 or greater, they have to put that purchase out to bid, whether it's for services or materials. It would increase that threshold limit, which hadn't been increased since 1978, to $10,000, which everyone in both the Assembly and Senate committees agreed seemed pretty reasonable. The bill passed in the Assembly, but there was a late night amendment to it that added a bunch of completely unrelated legislation related to PFAS regulation. PFAS are this new or newly emergent problem. They're chemicals that are used in firefighting foam and Teflon and numerous commercial products that are showing up more and more in our waters. There was a controversial amendment added to this bill that frankly, very few people except the people that gave the amendment seem to like. And so even if this bill was taken up in the Senate, because of that amendment, the fate of it was extremely unclear. Next slide. This bill also has an unclear fate in the Senate because of the Senate not getting to it yet. But it was also a bill that got a lot of attention. You may have seen billboards or received postcards or heard advertisements on the radio from the Realtors Association about this bill. And what it would do, it would overturn a 2018 Wisconsin Supreme Court decision, Movich v. Lobermeyer, which held that the owner of, if a private entity owns lake bed in an impoundment in front of a different riparian owner, that riparian owner can be prevented from placing a pier or other structures, because if you own property, you have the ability to keep people off of that property. And just because the Supreme Court held, just because that property was flooded, didn't supersede that sort of fundamental property right. This bill would flip that decision to say that the riparian right, that the generally presumed right to place a pier or other structures, would take precedence. And so even though someone else might own that lake bed, then the riparian owner would have the right to place a pier. Our feeling was that uh, the potential problems that this caused, that was being brought up by the realtors, there was a lot of rhetoric that everyone was going to lose their piers, was pretty heavily overstated. That was not going to be the case on most lakes in the state. And in fact, the bill ended up kind of walking back a little bit of what it was trying to do, because it gave a whole lot of room to utilities who have who own the lake bed, because they were worried that allowing people to be able to do riparian kinds of things on their lake bed would put them in violation with the licensing agreements they have with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and other entities. So there's still a lot of work, actually, in my opinion, to be done with this bill to make clear exactly what's going to happen with it. And it's unclear whether this is going to get enacted. If the Senate does vote on something, I wouldn't be at all surprised if this was not one of the ones that was in that package, and I think it probably would pass, but that will just depend on whether the Senate votes. Next slide. So notably, some things that we haven't seen this session include, we haven't really seen a whole lot of bills reducing protection for wetlands. We were worried coming into the session that there would be some actions to try to change the definition of navigability. Not only have we not seen loosening restrictions on high capacity wells, but because of an Attorney General's opinion just recently and actions by the DNR, we actually probably will start seeing cumulative review of the environmental impact of high capacity wells in an area when a well permit is being considered. But because of the threat of Governor Evers' veto, there has not been as much legislation rolling back environmental protections as we have seen in the past from this legislature. Next slide. And we've also seen over the course of the 2 years a real focus on water quality. So the governor in 2019 declared it the year of clean drinking water, and Speaker Voss created the Task Force on Water Quality. You can go to the next slide. The task force was a bipartisan joint committee of Assembly and the Senate. It held statewide hearings throughout the summer of 2019. There was one in Tomahawk, so I'm sure some of you probably were there. I sat through a lot of those, and they often went on 6 to 8 hours. So it was a lot of work. There was a lot of information collected. I have to say, I really think the members of the committee did pay attention. Just watching through multiple hearings, they were asking questions based on testimony that they heard from people in previous hearings. That was pretty clear. They released a report at the beginning of 2020 along with 13 different pieces of legislation covering a whole raft of different things: restorative agricultural practices, some PFAS mitigation and regulation bills, things covering lead pipe replacement, dealing with nitrates in wells, university research funding, and some other things. Most of those bills passed in the Assembly, and again, their fate is unclear in the Senate. even before the pandemic hit, there was some concern that the bills that cost very much were likely to run into some pretty heavy opposition in the Senate. You can go to the next slide. So Wisconsin Lake supported a number of them. The one down at the bottom, I won't go into that one, but that was not one of the Water Quality Task Force bills, but we did support that one. The first two bullets were the ones we really were most interested in. The County Conservation Department bill would fully fund County Conservation Department staff levels at the amount that is really supposed to be required by the statutes that had never been fully funded. So that would have done that. And that bill was universally, everybody on any side of any of these issues pretty much testified, yeah, we like that bill. We think that should go through. And it looked like it was going to sail through. And now even that one is kind of up for question. The restorative ag assistance package is kind of an omnibus bill that would do a whole bunch of things, support managed grazing, cover crop research and implementation, provide incentives for restorative agriculture. And one other piece of that I'll specifically point out that we really liked was the opening of the surface water grant program to producer-led councils, these groups of farmers that are getting together and working on better conservation practices for themselves. We like that because we felt there was enough money in the program to be able to support them, and in general, they wouldn't really be able to go forward with the lake grant without working with a lake group in the area in order to get the project started, which is something that we've been trying to promote. So we think it would be a good way to sort of spur collaboration between agriculture and local lake organizations. Next slide. There were some bills that we didn't like. I won't go into any detail on those, except for the biomanipulation project funding. That did have a lake focus. We just didn't feel biomanipulation is the idea of using, removing carp or trying to manipulate the balance of an ecosystem in order to help stop algae growth. We didn't feel that needed to be funded. That was sort of a pet project by a legislator in the western part of the state. And so we were opposed just to spending money on that when there was lake grant money that was available, and that money could be spent elsewhere. Next slide. And lastly, there, as I said, were a whole bunch of bills related to PFAS. They all kind of did different things. One of them did pass. It was a fairly simple bill that regulated firefighting foam, so it didn't go very far, didn't cover very many aspects of these chemicals. But this is sort of the emerging threat for groundwater pollution, certainly, but there are instances where it's beginning to show up in surface waters as well, and in a number of different parts of the state as well. So PFAS is something that's not going to go away, and literally it doesn't go away because it doesn't go away in the environment, but the issue is not going to go away. We're going to see more and more legislation regarding this as we move forward. Next slide. Here's just some ways to keep informed and act. You can, of course, always follow what we're doing on wisconsinlakes.org and through our emails. I've got the legislature's website up there, which is a great way to look at and find bills. Wisconsin Eye, if you're not familiar with that, is video of pretty much of most of the goings-ons of the legislature, including most of the committee meetings and all. And then, of course, talk to your legislators. And that's all I have, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have on anything.
Mike, this is Bob Martini. I would just wanted to point out that there are over 3,800 licensed dams in Wisconsin, a whole bunch that aren't licensed, and 130 FERC licensed dams. So that issue of flowed privately owned lands is pretty important because it could result in proliferation of a lot of piers and structures that are not now allowed because someone else owns the land compared to the riparian owner.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Bob. And the utilities were very strong and vocal. That bill really came down to a fight between the utilities and the realtors and the towns association. The towns association and realtors were in favor of it, and the utilities really pretty strongly argued against it because they didn't want to lose that control of the lake beds that they owned. And so your point's well taken.
Quick question. This is Larry Beaumont. Question is, in all of your travels across the state, have you seen what people are doing about controlling wake boats?
I figured that one would come up. I almost put in a slide, but then I thought I don't need to because someone will ask the question. So that's a long way of saying, yeah, I've seen quite a bit of that. It's a very difficult issue, and it's one that is cropping up around the country. And I've had conversations with folks from Minnesota and New Hampshire where they're actually doing some things with their legislature to try to their legislature has actually conducted a study which is either out now or it was supposed to come out this month. And I've kind of been waiting to see what the result of that is before pursuing any kind of legislative action here in Wisconsin. In the short term, there have not been a whole lot of successful local ordinance actions, except I just recently learned I believe it's the village of Mequon has an ordinance that regulates enhanced wakes and has had that in place since I think 2010. And I guess there have been successful enforcement actions on it. So if you just Google Mequon and boating ordinance, you'll find that language. I've seen it used in other ordinance attempts as well, but in general, it's been hard to get these things passed. They can be hard to enforce, which is not necessarily a reason to not pass them. But we don't have a whole lot of examples except that Mequon one across the state.
Question, Bob Mott, Oneida County.
Yeah, hi, Bob.
Hi, Mike. There's a resolution going around that's asking for a special session for the water bills. Have you heard anything about that? And you think there's a possibility?
I'm not 100% sure what the resolution that you're referring to is. When I have talked to legislators and talked to other lobbyists, which has not been, I haven't talked to anyone for a couple of weeks about this, but I have not heard that there has been any appetite to to get a special session going on these. I really think it really all comes down to Scott Fitzgerald, the leader of the Senate. If the Republicans gain a lot of seats in the fall and gain a veto-proof majority, then they don't really have any reason to do anything in the fall because they'll have better control over what they do in January. If the Democrats pick up a couple of seats and it seems like that might influence how legislation turns out, then it would be more likely that they would hold some sort of session in the November and December to get some stuff done. But it's not just the water bills that didn't pass, it's all sorts of different legislation. And they had been talking about, like a couple of days of 10 to 12 hours of legislation that they needed to take up and pass. And now you've got the added problems of more legislation probably needing to be considered for COVID related stuff. So whether something gets tacked on to a special session related to COVID, that could happen, but I haven't heard any rumors to that effect.
Thank you.
Amy or Eric, anything in the chat box?
Nothing yet.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions here for Mike? Well, thanks, Mike.
Not a question, but keep up the good work, Mike, with your organization.
Thank you.
Yeah, advocacy really hits the road with Mike's group, and they do such a wonderful job of keeping us all across the state in tune with what's going on there. So we really appreciate their work.